Have you ever smiled while your entire future was quietly being erased and realized no one in the room noticed the difference? I remember the exact angle of the conference table, the faint reflection of my own face in the polished wood, the way Richard Collins didn't even look up when he decided in one careless sentence that I was replaceable. And I nodded as if he had just commented on the weather, not on the 8 years I had poured into a system that quietly depended on me. And I felt something detach inside me. Not anger, not yet, just a hollow pressure, like the air had been slowly removed from a sealed room, because I understood instantly that it wasn't only about the role, it was about identity, about the version of myself that believed competence protected you, that loyalty mattered, that being indispensable was enough. And while everyone shifted in their seats and moved on to the next slide, I realized they were already adjusting to a future without me, laughing, planning, redistributing my responsibilities as if I had already left. And I sat there calculating the silence, noticing how Oliver avoided eye contact, how Richard's tone softened when he spoke to others but stayed clipped when he addressed me, how the CEO's name appeared in a forwarded email chain I hadn't been included in, and the humiliation didn't feel loud. It felt clinical, procedural, irreversible, like paperwork already filed. And I kept breathing evenly, kept taking notes, because reacting would have meant admitting the loss in real time, and I wasn't ready to watch my own collapse in front of them. So I folded the feeling inward, let it settle into something colder, something patient, something that didn't need their approval anymore. Because by the time the meeting ended, I understood they hadn't just questioned my value, they had quietly removed my future. And I walked out knowing I hadn't lost a job yet, but I had already lost the version of myself that believed this place was mine. And that was the moment I stopped trying to belong. The words didn't echo in the room, they echoed inside me. I watched Richard's lips move again, explaining quarterly targets, but the sound reached me like it was filtered through water. Outwardly, I kept my posture straight. I even nodded once, as if I agreed. Inside, something fractured slowly, almost politely. I remember noticing small things, the ticking clock above the glass wall, the faint hum of the air conditioner, the way Oliver typed too loudly, as if filling the silence I couldn't hear anymore. I replayed the sentence in my mind, anyone in this role is replaceable, and each time it sounded less like an opinion and more like a decision already made. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I had survived worse, but my hands stayed unusually still on the table, because I was afraid if I moved them, someone would see the tremor I couldn't fully control. I left the meeting with the same measured pace I always used. No one stopped me. No one even glanced up. That hurt more than the words. The hallway lights felt too bright. I walked past the team area and heard laughter, not about me, not directed at me, just normal office noise, but it sounded wrong, like I had stepped into a scene that no longer required my presence. I sat at my desk and opened my inbox. 3 emails I should have been copied on were already resolved. Someone else had answered a client question I usually handled. It wasn't obvious, it wasn't dramatic, but it was there, subtle, efficient, clean. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself this was temporary. But then I noticed a shared document had been updated. My name had quietly moved from owner to support. No announcement, no explanation, just a small change in a column. That was when the fracture deepened, because demotions don't always come as conversations. Sometimes they arrive as formatting edits. I leaned back, kept my face neutral, even responded to a routine request with my usual calm tone. No one suspected anything. And yet, underneath that calm, I felt the first cold realization forming. The betrayal wasn't just what had been said in the meeting, it was already spreading into places I hadn't even looked yet. And that was when I began to understand. Something about this was far more deliberate than it appeared. I replayed the meeting again that night, not for what was said, but for what I didn't say. I didn't ask why my responsibilities had shifted. I didn't question the sudden silence around my projects. I pretended not to notice that Oliver had been given access to dashboards I built. I even congratulated him when he mentioned new opportunities. My voice sounded steady, too steady, because inside I had already started mapping the loss. It wasn't just a role, it was credibility, influence, the quiet authority I had built over years. Without it, I wasn't just replaceable, I was invisible. The next morning, I arrived early. My access card hesitated for half a second longer than usual before unlocking the system. Probably nothing, but then I checked the shared calendar. A strategy session had been scheduled, my project, my client, and I wasn't invited. That's when the disturbing detail surfaced. The meeting description used language from documentation only I had written. They weren't just replacing me, they were using me as the blueprint. I sat there, staring at the screen, and for the first time, the humiliation didn't fade when I stepped away. It followed me. It lingered in every interaction. I answered questions people used to ask me directly, but now through group chats where my input looked optional. I smiled, I remained helpful, I became cooperative. And the more cooperative I became, the easier it was for them to continue. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? If it followed you into every email, every meeting, every quiet redistribution of your identity? I realized something irreversible had already happened. My future here wasn't shrinking, it had already been reassigned. Then I saw the final piece, a draft organizational chart. My name wasn't removed. It was placed under someone I had trained. No announcement, just preparation. That's when the last illusion broke. This wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't miscommunication. It was structured, gradual, intentional. And as I closed the file, I understood the most dangerous part. They believed I still hadn't noticed. The strange thing about being quietly erased is how invisible you become while still sitting in the same chair. The days after that realization felt slower, heavier, but I stopped reacting. I spoke less. I watched more. Richard seemed relaxed now, almost relieved, as if removing me from the center had simplified everything. He joked during meetings. He leaned back in his chair. He stopped double-checking numbers because someone else, usually Oliver, was presenting them, and I noticed how easily they filled the space I had left, even if the fit wasn't perfect. I stayed silent. I answered questions when asked. I delivered small tasks on time. Nothing more. The less I resisted, the more comfortable they became. I watched them celebrate minor wins. I watched Richard praise Oliver for streamlining processes I had built. I even clapped lightly once, just enough to blend in. Inside, I was measuring patterns. Who depended on which data? Which client communications ran through which approvals? Which deadlines were tight enough to cause panic if disturbed? One afternoon, I overheard Richard in the hallway, laughing with a senior manager. "We're finally reducing single-point dependency," he said. I kept walking, pretending I hadn't heard. But that sentence stayed with me, because the irony was obvious. They believed dependency was gone, yet they still relied on structures no one fully understood, structures I hadn't dismantled. Not yet. I started noticing smaller things. Oliver hesitated before answering technical questions. He deferred decisions upward instead of making them himself. Richard skimmed reports rather than reading them fully. The team trusted summaries more than raw data. That was the weakness, not technical, but behavioral. They had replaced experience with confidence. They believed the system was stable because it looked familiar. I didn't move.
I didn't interfere. I simply watched as they relaxed into that assumption. Meetings shortened, oversight loosened, deadlines were approved without verification. The more they underestimated me, the more access I retained without suspicion. Then, during a routine review, I noticed something specific: a client dashboard pulling from a dependency that only refreshed correctly under a condition no one else knew about. Oliver had changed part of it, not enough to break immediately, just enough to fail under pressure. I said nothing. I simply noted the date of the next reporting cycle. And for the first time since the meeting, I realized they had handed me something quietly, a weakness they didn't even know existed.
I didn't act immediately. That was the most difficult part: restraint. The reporting cycle arrived on a Thursday morning. Everything looked normal. The numbers populated, the charts loaded, the team prepared the presentation. I sat slightly back from the table, taking notes I didn't need. Oliver spoke confidently, referencing trends and projections. Richard nodded, satisfied. The client joined the call. Then the question came, a routine clarification about a variance in quarterly data. Oliver clicked to expand the chart. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the numbers recalculated, incorrectly. Subtle, but wrong enough to trigger doubt. Oliver paused. He refreshed. The discrepancy remained. Richard leaned forward. The client asked another question. The calm tone shifted just slightly. I stayed quiet. I watched the tension ripple. Oliver tried to explain. He mentioned a temporary sync delay. The client requested confirmation. Richard looked around the table. No one volunteered. I finally spoke, softly, carefully, suggesting they verify the raw data set before finalizing conclusions. It sounded helpful, neutral, harmless, but it slowed everything. The meeting extended. Confidence weakened. After the call, Richard pulled Oliver aside. I overheard fragments: accuracy, review process, can't afford this. No blame landed directly, but the doubt had been planted, and doubt, once introduced, spreads quietly. That afternoon, I restored the condition so the dashboard would function normally again. No lasting damage, no obvious sabotage, just a brief moment of instability. A reminder that the system wasn't as independent as they believed. The win was small, almost invisible, but I felt the shift. Richard started double-checking reports again. Oliver spoke less confidently. Meetings grew slightly more cautious. They didn't connect it to me. They saw it as a technical glitch. But I knew exactly what it was: the first fracture. They thought it was over. I knew it had just started.
The ripple from that small fracture didn't explode. It spread quietly, like a hairline crack in glass that only becomes visible under pressure. The following week, meetings started lasting longer. Richard began asking for backup files. Oliver checked numbers twice before presenting. Outwardly, nothing looked dramatic, but the confidence that once filled the room had thinned. And I noticed how quickly uncertainty changes behavior. People spoke more cautiously, decisions slowed. The silence between questions stretched just a little longer. I remained exactly the same: calm, cooperative, invisible. I responded to requests without hesitation. I even helped Oliver troubleshoot a minor formatting issue, keeping my tone neutral, almost supportive. The more helpful I appeared, the less anyone suspected me. But internally, I felt something shifting in myself, too. Revenge didn't feel emotional anymore. It felt procedural, measured, like I was following a sequence rather than reacting. That realization unsettled me. I wasn't angry when I watched them hesitate. I was analytical, detached, as if I had stepped outside my own identity. Then pressure arrived from outside. A major U.S. client scheduled a high-stakes renewal meeting. The contract represented months of revenue. Richard emphasized accuracy repeatedly. Deadlines tightened. Reports needed validation. Suddenly, the room felt different. Not panicked, but tense, like everyone was aware of the stakes. I watched how Oliver struggled to keep pace. He stayed late revising slides. Richard reviewed drafts personally, something he hadn't done in weeks. I noticed something else. In their urgency to secure the deal, they created shortcuts. Approvals pushed faster, assumptions left unchecked. The very pressure meant to strengthen them exposed new gaps. I didn't need to create problems anymore. The environment was doing it naturally. All I had to do was remain present and patient. During one late evening, I saw Richard leave his office without locking his screen, a risk he never took before. On it, the draft proposal for the renewal deal, incomplete, rushed, dependent on data pipelines only partially verified. I didn't touch anything. I simply memorized what I saw. Because now the tension wasn't theoretical. A deadline was approaching, a deal was closing, and the smallest misalignment could unravel everything. And for the first time, I sensed that the pressure building around them was becoming something they couldn't easily control. The closer the renewal meeting came, the more cautious everyone became, except me. I stayed steady, predictable, harmless. That was the role I needed them to believe. Richard stopped joking. Oliver's voice tightened during presentations. The team whispered more in hallways. I watched it all without changing my pace. But maintaining that harmless image required discipline. There were moments I wanted to step in, to correct obvious flaws, to stop the slow drift toward instability. Not out of loyalty, out of habit. 8 years of reflex don't disappear overnight. I had to remind myself why I stayed silent, because every correction I made would strengthen them. Every silence weakened their certainty. How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it? That question followed me through the days leading up to the deadline. I smiled during check-ins. I nodded when Oliver explained assumptions I knew were fragile. I even reassured Richard once, telling him the structure looked solid. It wasn't a lie. It was just incomplete. The night before the final submission, I stayed late again. The office was almost empty. Cleaning staff moved quietly through the corridors. I reviewed my own archived folders, something no one monitored anymore. Old documentation, legacy dependencies, access permissions, things they assumed no longer mattered. Then I found it. Not something I created, but something I had maintained years ago. A fallback data routing rule tied to a rarely used validation step. If triggered under certain conditions, it wouldn't break the system. It would delay confirmations just enough to create uncertainty at the worst possible moment. No alarms, no obvious errors, just hesitation where confidence was required. I stared at the configuration, feeling the weight of what it represented. I didn't activate anything, not yet. I simply confirmed it still existed, still functional, still invisible. Because now I understood something clearly. I wasn't just watching events unfold anymore. I had access to something that could tilt the outcome without leaving fingerprints. And as I closed the file, I realized the next move wouldn't create chaos, it would reveal it. The renewal week arrived quietly, but the tension in the office felt heavier than any deadline I had experienced before. No one said it out loud, yet everyone moved faster, spoke softer, checked their screens more often. Richard scheduled back-to-back reviews. Oliver revised slides repeatedly, each version only slightly different from the last. I stayed calm, almost detached, answering small requests, offering minor clarifications, never stepping into the center again. Outwardly, I looked cooperative. Inside, I watched the structure bend under its own pressure. The first sign appeared during an internal rehearsal. The The numbers loaded, but the validation timestamp lagged. Not broken, just delayed. Richard frowned at the screen, then quickly masked it with a confident tone. "Probably just syncing," he said. Oliver nodded, though I could see uncertainty in his posture. I didn't react. I simply took notes, as if the delay meant nothing. But the room felt different afterward. Conversations shortened. People avoided eye contact. By the time the client joined the call, the atmosphere had shifted again. Richard spoke smoothly, emphasizing reliability, stability, growth. Oliver navigated the dashboards. And then, right at the point where confidence mattered most, the confirmation metrics hesitated again. Half a second, then another. The client asked for clarification. Richard answered, calm but slightly rushed. Oliver refreshed the screen. The numbers appeared, correct, but late enough to introduce doubt. I remained silent, hands folded, expression neutral. Chaos didn't look like chaos from the outside. It looked like hesitation, and hesitation spread faster than mistakes. The client requested follow-up documentation. Richard agreed immediately. The call ended politely, but the energy drained from the room. Afterward, Richard began connecting threads. He didn't accuse anyone directly, but his eyes moved more carefully around the table. He asked Oliver to double-check everything. He requested logs. He even glanced at me once, not suspiciously, just searching, as if trying to understand where the instability originated. I met his gaze calmly. No defensiveness, no explanation, just stillness. That seemed to unsettle him more than any reaction. Later that afternoon, he approached my desk casually. "You've seen older versions of this system," he said. "Anything unusual?" His tone was neutral, but the question wasn't. I shook my head slightly, choosing my words carefully. "Nothing obvious. It's probably just load timing." He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. And as he walked away, I realized something had changed. The doubt was no longer only about the system. It was beginning to turn toward people. That was when he decided to confront me properly.
He called me into his office the next morning. The door closed softly behind me, but the tension inside felt louder than any raised voice. Richard didn't sit immediately. He stood by the window, arms crossed as if arranging his thoughts. "You've been very quiet lately," he said finally. It sounded like an observation, not an accusation. I kept my posture relaxed. "Just focusing on assigned tasks," I replied. He nodded slowly, then turned toward his desk. "You built parts of this infrastructure," he continued. "You'd know if something wasn't right." The sentence lingered. I understood what he was asking without him saying it directly. I also understood that any defensive response would confirm suspicion, so I stayed calm. "Systems evolve," I said. "Small inconsistencies happen." He watched me carefully, searching for something. Guilt, hesitation, anything. But the plan had been moving long before this conversation, long before the meeting where he called me replaceable, long before Oliver received access. I had been documenting dependencies months earlier, back when I still believed I was protecting the team. Ironically, those precautions had become the foundation of everything unfolding now. Richard leaned forward slightly. "If there's something you're not telling me, now would be the time." The words sounded firm, but there was uncertainty underneath. He wasn't sure. He couldn't be sure. And that was the most powerful position, suspicion without proof. I shook my head gently. "If I notice anything, I'll let you know." My voice didn't waver. He exhaled slowly, frustration visible but restrained. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with ambiguity. I stood, nodded politely, and left the office. Outside, the team was already discussing follow-up requests from the client. The pressure was increasing, and the subtle delays were already influencing their confidence, their timelines, their decisions. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but the momentum had shifted. Because what Richard didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that the chain reaction had already started days earlier. Processes had already diverged, assumptions had already changed, and by the time he began asking questions, the damage was already irreversible.
The days after the confrontation felt heavier than anything before. The office moved faster, but I felt slower inside, like every step required deliberate control. Richard tightened oversight, Oliver stayed late every night, the renewal decision from the client was still pending, and that uncertainty pressed down on everyone. Emails multiplied, requests overlapped, and for the first time I felt the risk turning toward me as well. Because the closer things came to breaking, the more likely someone would start retracing steps carefully. I caught myself almost stepping in more than once. During one review, Oliver misinterpreted a dependency I knew would cause another delay. The instinct to correct him rose immediately. Years of habit, reflex, responsibility. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then I stopped. If I fixed it, I would stabilize them. If I stayed silent, the uncertainty would continue spreading. That hesitation lingered longer than I expected, because this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about who I was becoming. I went to the break room, poured coffee I didn't drink, and stared at the reflection in the microwave door. My face looked calm, but I didn't recognize the stillness. Revenge had started as calculation. Now it felt like erosion. I had lost more than status. I had lost the version of myself that intervened to prevent failure. And that realization almost pushed me to walk away from everything, to let them recover, to stop before the consequences grew larger than intended. That afternoon, Richard announced a final internal audit before the client's decision. My chest tightened slightly. Audits meant logs, timestamps, patterns, the kind of scrutiny that could expose anomalies. I remained composed, but internally I calculated timelines. Most of the shifts were subtle, distributed, hard to trace. Still, the risk existed. For the first time, I felt the possibility of exposure. Not dramatic, not immediate, but real. The audit began. Questions circulated. Oliver looked exhausted. Richard's tone grew sharper. I answered everything directly, calmly, providing just enough clarity to remain helpful without redirecting attention. But the pressure kept building. Each hour felt like standing on a surface that might crack. By evening, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't just watching their collapse anymore. I was standing inside it. And if the structure fell too suddenly, I might fall with it. For a brief moment, I considered stopping completely, ending the sequence, letting events stabilize. But the silence I carried felt heavier than retreat. And as the night deepened, the tension reached a point where even breathing felt like holding something fragile together. The reversal came quietly, almost accidentally. During the audit review, a senior manager questioned a delay in validation timestamps. Richard assumed it was recent. Oliver tried to explain. Then the manager referenced archived performance logs, data from months earlier. The implication shifted instantly. The delays weren't new. They were historical, intermittent, embedded long before the current team adjustments. I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly. The narrative changed in real time. Instead of looking for a recent cause, the discussion turned toward legacy infrastructure. Richard frowned, reconsidering assumptions. Oliver looked relieved, though still confused. The focus moved away from individuals and toward system evolution, exactly where it needed to be. I remained silent, letting the conversation reshape itself. No intervention required. The plan didn't need defense, it needed patience. But the emotional cost stayed. I realized I no longer felt satisfaction, only inevitability. I watched them piece together explanations that almost, but not quite, touched the truth. And I wondered if winning meant becoming someone I no longer recognized, would I still finish? That question settled heavily, but I didn't answer it. The client's response arrived late the next afternoon. Not a rejection, not approval, a request for extended verification. The delay itself was enough. It signaled doubt, it signaled instability, and the room reacted instantly. Richard's composure slipped for the first time. Oliver stared at the email, rereading it. Conversations became urgent. Then Richard looked up, not at the team, but directly at me. Not accusing, not certain, just a long, searching look, as if something finally aligned in his mind. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The realization wasn't complete, but it had begun. And in that silence, I understood he finally sensed that the collapse wasn't random and that someone inside the room had never truly been harmless.
The collapse didn't arrive as a dramatic moment. It unfolded slowly, like a structure losing support one beam at a time. The client's extended verification turned into deeper scrutiny. Additional documentation requests followed. Timelines slipped. Each delay looked minor on its own, but together they eroded confidence. Richard stopped trying to mask the pressure. His voice tightened in meetings. Oliver's shoulders remained tense even when nothing was happening. I stayed exactly the same, calm, measured, quiet. I answered questions when asked. I provided archived documentation that clarified older dependencies, but never enough to restore certainty. The more information surfaced, the more complicated the system appeared. Richard spent hours reviewing logs. He searched for a single cause. There wasn't one. That was the inevitability of it. The instability wasn't a break, it was a pattern, and patterns are harder to fight. The client eventually postponed the renewal decision. Not a termination, just hesitation. But hesitation was enough. Internally, leadership began reviewing oversight processes. Emails from senior executives arrived, requesting explanations. Richard's authority weakened subtly. He was still in charge, but his confidence no longer filled the room. Oliver spoke less, deferring everything upward. The team adjusted, quietly stepping back from decisions. I delivered the final pieces calmly. I handed over documentation showing how dependencies had evolved, emphasizing the need for long-term restructuring. It sounded helpful, constructive, but it also confirmed that the instability wasn't temporary. It would take months to fix. The momentum shifted completely. The narrative moved from small issue to systemic weakness. Richard stopped confronting me. He didn't need to. He understood something fundamental, that the control he believed he had never truly existed. The realization showed in his posture, in the pauses before he spoke. He looked at me once during a meeting, not with anger, but with recognition. I didn't react. There was nothing left to prove. The collapse wasn't loud. It was procedural, inevitable, already underway. And as leadership scheduled formal reviews, I realized the final move wasn't an action. It was simply allowing everything to continue without interference.
When it ended, there was no announcement, no confrontation, just quiet outcomes. The renewal deal was reassigned to another team. Richard's role shifted to a support function during the restructuring. Oliver was moved to a narrower scope. The organization described it as operational realignment, neutral words for a slow unraveling. I watched it happen without satisfaction, only stillness. What I lost never returned. The identity I built over 8 years, the trusted problem solver, the quiet authority, was already gone the moment I was called replaceable. But something else came back instead. Control. Not over them, but over myself. I stopped measuring my worth by recognition. I stopped correcting every flaw. I learned how silence can carry more weight than argument. In the weeks that followed, I submitted my resignation. No drama, no explanation. Richard nodded when I handed him the letter. He didn't argue. He understood. The system would stabilize eventually, but the dynamics had changed permanently, and I didn't belong to that version anymore. On my last day, I cleared my desk slowly. No one made speeches, a few polite goodbyes. The office looked exactly the same, but I felt detached from it, like leaving a place that had already faded. As I walked out, I realized the revenge had never been about destroying them. It was about refusing to remain invisible, about letting underestimation reveal its own consequences. I stepped outside, the air colder than expected, and for the first time in months, the tension inside me eased. The loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.